On August 13, 1983, Starkey Swenson left his home on bicycle and set off into the Neenah, Wisconsin night. His planned destination and route are unknown. What is known, he was never heard from again. 10 years later, with no trace of Swenson's body ever found, a man was arrested and charged with Swenson's murder. He maintains his innocence, but halts his 1994 trial by accepting a lesser charge and is sentenced to 2 years in prison. To this day, that man, John C. Andrews, refuses to admit any involvement or guilt in the crime. Starkey Swenson's body has never been found. I'm Dr. Jordan Karsten, and together with my team, I've been asked by investigators to help find the body and with it, answers. In this podcast, we will review the case in detail, applying today's knowledge and technology, and chronicle the effort to locate and recover the lost body of Starkey Swenson. This is Cold Case Frozen Tundra, Episode 3, Burden of Proof.
Corpus delicti. It's a Latin phrase which, when translated to English, reads body of the crime, and is a term that applies to all criminal cases in the United States. As a legal principle, corpus delicti requires that investigators and prosecutors provide proof a crime ever took place before an individual may be charged with that crime. Contrary to what one might assume, corpus delicti does not mean that a body must be found in order to prove a murder occurred. It does, however, mean that in situations where a corpse has not been discovered, the prosecution must rely on other sources of evidence to show the crime has, in fact, been committed. It's worth mentioning that in most murder cases, the body of the victim is the primary source of evidence. And, historically, in cases where a body has not been found, another form of forensic evidence, DNA, fingerprints, fibers, or something similar, is typically used to prove the murder took place. And so, in March 1994, as Winnebago County District Attorney Joseph Paulus stood to address the newly formed jury, taking time to scan the faces of each of its 12 members and 2 alternates as they anxiously awaited his opening statement, he knew he faced a challenge. Joseph Paulus began to explain to them how, without a body, DNA, or physical evidence of any kind, he would prove that John C. Andrews murdered Starkey Swenson on August 13, 1983.
Hello and welcome to Cold Case Frozen Tundra. I'm Dr. Jordan Karsten, professor of anthropology at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, and your co-host, along with Matt Hiskus, for this investigation into the disappearance of Starkey Swenson, who was last seen riding away on his bicycle from his Neenah, Wisconsin home in August 1983. In our last 2 episodes, we shared what's publicly known of the decade-long missing person investigation. We discussed detectives' inquiries into one man, John C. Andrews, since very early in the case. Their investigation into John Andrews even included a John Doe hearing, with Andrews as their person of interest, which, along with their other inquiries, for many years did not turn up evidence that would lead to an arrest. Suddenly, after 10 years without a single break in the Starkey Swenson case, it was reclassified from a missing person investigation to a murder in September 1993. Andrews, 10 years past his initial questioning and several years since his John Doe hearing, was arrested and charged with Starkey's murder.
In our second episode, we shared the stories that led to this seemingly sudden reversal in the investigation. Through their testimony at a pretrial preliminary hearing, in which the state must present its evidence and receive court approval to proceed in bringing the case to trial, Lois Swenson, wife of the victim Starkey, Claire Andrews, ex-wife of the accused John, and Suzanne Eggert, John's girlfriend at the time of the murder, presented their accounts of the days preceding Starkey Swenson's murder, of the day he disappeared, and of the weeks and months after Starkey Swenson went missing.
That's right. The three women provided details that certainly helped explain the sudden break in the case, which really, up until that point, had gone quite stagnant. All three women gave investigators and the court a plausible motive for John Andrews to murder Starkey Swenson. Starkey, they said, had been involved in a long-term affair with Claire Andrews, and John was furious about it. Claire admitted to the court that the affair had begun years before she met John. It was the cause of why she and John split after just 6 weeks of marriage, and that it had continued since the divorce. Lois Swenson and Suzanne Eggert corroborated the testimony, Lois stating that she had been aware of her husband's infidelity for years, and Suzanne reporting that she'd heard of Starkey and Claire's ongoing affair through John, who brought it up often, in anger. The most telling testimony of the preliminary hearing, the new information which had truly broken the case open and which led to John Andrews' arrest, came from Suzanne Eggert, who told the court that she'd finally opened up to investigators after a decade of silence that she'd kept out of fear of retaliation from John.
Suzanne Eggert confirmed for the court what she had told police before John's arrest. She said that she had been driving around town while waiting for John to visit her at her home on the day and into the night of August 13th, and that she ended up outside Claire's house. She'd known John was there, across the street from the Shattuck Junior High School. That night, Suzanne said, she overheard two men arguing in a courtyard on the school grounds. She said she recognized one of them as John due to his distinctive British accent. She'd heard the other man involved in the altercation pleading, "No, John, don't." She also heard that man scream, "Oh God," followed by noises of a car engine revving, metal and wood crunching and dragging, and ultimately, John's voice stating, "There, now you're dead. How do you like that?" Suzanne lastly told the court she'd driven around the school before leaving, and she saw John leaning into the open trunk of his blue Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. She says he's still in the grassy alcove at the school at this time, that she can't see what's in his trunk or what he's doing as he leans into it. The next day, Suzanne states, she'd spent time with John, witnessed both cuts on his hands and damage to his car, which John tried to explain away, and was even then threatened by John to keep silent, which she did for 10 years.
The testimony of Lois Swenson, Suzanne Eggert, and Claire Andrews is without a doubt set to serve as the linchpin of the state's case against John Andrews in his upcoming trial. It's powerful and emotional testimony, but it's not without its weaknesses.
Of the three witnesses for the state, two, Claire Andrews and Suzanne Eggert, are able to speak to the court about John's actions on the day of the murder. Claire, because she was with John that day, and Suzanne, because she overheard the events of that night. Together, they comprise a cohesive and compelling timeline of events around the time Starkey Swenson disappeared. However, both Claire and Suzanne are John's ex-lovers, and for that reason are not the ideal witnesses in a case against him.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility that they both have an axe to grind with John. We aren't saying that they are being in any way untruthful in their testimony, but it doesn't take a brilliant legal mind to see that this is a scenario the defense team will want to exploit during the trial. They will use each woman's testimony, Claire's recounting of a short-lived marriage filled with emotional manipulation, and Suzanne's report of John's threats against her and her children, as a reason the women harbor anger towards John and want to see him behind bars.
Yeah, that position from the defense definitely makes sense to me. And then we have the state's third witness, Lois Swenson. Lois's testimony of her knowledge of Starkey's affair, the frequency with which he visited Claire Andrews, and the problems it caused in their marriage is, while both shocking and interesting, really, only just that. Shock and interest added to the case. It provides context for the possible motive, certainly, but she's not a witness to John Andrews' whereabouts or actions on the day of the disappearance. Lois adds some color and depth to the case, but she's not able to point the finger at John.